So thanks for those who are spending a really beautiful Friday afternoon here with us. So I have the honor of introducing Michael Lynch, and I'm going to largely read his bio because it's quite impressive and long, and I don't want to miss anything. So Mr. Lynch is currently a legislative aide in the California State Assembly for Assembly Member Reggie Jones Sawyer. He's the lead advisor in several policy areas, including education, banking, finance, human services, housing, and economic development. Mr. Lynch is also the co-founder and CEO of Improve Your Tomorrow, IYT, a nonprofit college prep program in South Sacramento. IYT was started in 2013 to inspire young men of color to break generational cycles of poverty, incarceration, and low educational attainment. The program provides weekly tutoring services, college tours, skill builder workshops, internships, and mentorships to its participants. Mr. Lynch began his career in politics and public policy as an intern for Assembly Member Wilmer Carter. Upon completion of that internship, he spent a summer in Washington, D.C., working as a government relations fellow for the Campaign for Youth Justice. Mr. Lynch would ultimately return to California to begin the Capital Fellowship Program with the Center for California Studies here at Sac State, where he served as a Senate Fellow in both the Office of Senator Corinne Price and the Senate Committee on Business, Professions, and Economic Development. While his interests include public policy, politics, and education, his passion is helping others, especially young men of color, find and serve their purpose. Mr. Lynch received his bachelor's degree in business management from Humboldt State University and his master's degree in public policy and administration here, Sacramento State. While at Humboldt State, Mr. Lynch played football, where he started over 30 games, served as team captain his senior year, and received several awards for stellar performance on the field and in the classroom. He's married to his college sweetheart, Andrea Lynch, and enjoys reading, playing sports, and spending time with his wife. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Michael Lynch.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan, for the great introduction. She knows my bio very well. So thank you again for taking the time to talk about my recently completed thesis titled "What is the Effect of Charter Schools on African American and Latino Students?" And just to let you all know, I recently entered the Student Research Symposium here at Sac State. So I'm trying to use this presentation really as a practice for the presentation I'm doing for the competition in 2 weeks. I would greatly appreciate any feedback you can give me, and I will my study and on my presentation, either after the presentation or through email. How I became interested in charter schools was after watching the 2010 documentary, Waiting for Superman. For those of you not familiar with the movie, it documented 5 families as they try to enroll their children in various high-performing charter schools. After I saw the movie, I began to reflect on my own journey going through traditional public schools in Stockton and South Sacramento. I mainly attended low-performing, high-poverty charter schools from high-poverty, low-performing traditional public schools through my K-12 education. And there was really 3 common metrics I learned, right, kind of all the schools I attended. I attended probably about 9 schools from K through 12. The first common one was there was a lack of motivation amongst the students. Second one was our classrooms were often under-resourced. And third one, most importantly, most often my teachers, my peers' teachers, didn't expect much from us. So really those common 3 factors really led to my peers' poor performance in school, but also it was most acute amongst the students who looked like me, who had brown and black skin. So after I saw the movie, I began to reflect, and I was thinking, maybe I would have been better prepared for college. My peers have had better academic outcomes if we would have attended a charter school. So that was really what sparked my interest in charter schools. So I had 2 questions driving my research. The first one was, what is the effect of charter schools on African American and Latino students, and how do they compare to their peers in traditional schools? My second question was, do charter schools, as compared to traditional public schools, help to better close the achievement gap? So these 2 questions drove my research last year for about 8 months. So I know many of you are familiar with the achievement gap. One thing I wasn't familiar with going into my research was how it gets progressively worse progressively worse as a student matriculates through grade school in California. This chart right here is a depiction of the California State Test English Language Arts Proficiency Standards. As you see, the 4th grade is bad, and the 8th grade it gets worse, and the 11th grade it gets progressively worse. I mean, African American students, 32% test proficient in English language arts, whereas white students is 62%. That's a 30% differential. That's not only bad for the African American community, and Latino community, it's really bad for California as a whole. So I chose to focus on charter schools and their concept of closing the achievement gaps for several reasons. One, because of that initial spark movie, Wake Up Superman, but 2 was because of 3 really high-performing charter schools. The Harlem Children's Zone, KIPP Academy, and St. Hope Academy. KIPP is a national charter management organization that manages several charter schools across the region, across the U.S. And for the most part, and almost every state they have a school in, one of the highest performing schools in that state. St. Hope Academy here locally, they operate 3 charter schools, one of them being PS7, and PS7 is a K-8 school. It's one of the top performing elementary schools in the area, and it serves primarily low-income African American and Latino students. Harlem Children's Zone, they have gotten national media attention for the performance of their students, which is again a traditionally underperforming population. And Students First, ran by Michelle Reed, the former CEO of Students First National Education nonprofit. Michelle Reed, the founder of Students First, is the former chancellor of the Washington, D.C. schools. And a couple years ago, she was on Oprah Winfrey, said she wanted to raise $1 billion for education. And she believed that charter schools were the answer to helping bridging the gap and closing that achievement gap for traditionally underperforming students. Charter schools over the past decade really have become increasingly popular. Just this past year, charter enrollment grew by 7%. In California, during this past academic year, 84 new charter schools opened up. I believe California currently has about 550,000 students enrolled in charter schools. That is a significant population. Nationally, 2.9 million students are enrolled in charter schools, a 14% increase from the previous year. Matter of fact, over the past decade, charter enrollment has increased about 1,000%. So there's a huge increase of parents choosing to enroll their kids in charter school without really much evidence showing that it's drastically improving performance. So throughout my thesis, I reviewed hundreds of articles and studies regarding the performance of charter schools. Really, I came to one solid conclusion. Research is inconclusive. There's no solid evidence either way. Well, there's no consensus amongst the research community on the performance of charter schools. Some charter schools are showing that their students are drastically increasing. Some other studies are saying, no, not quite. And what I found was that the research that's showing the high impact charter schools, they really have 2 main practices. They have longer school days and longer school years. So overall, their students are going to school a lot more than the neighborhood traditional school. And also it's kind of the best indicator of student success. I know as many of you know in this room is the best indicator of student success is household income and parent education level. So if you're an upper middle class child whose parents have gone to college already, most likely you will do very well in our public school system. So I had 3 hypotheses going into my study. I believed that African American students that charter schools were more effective for African American students. I also believed that charter schools were hoping to close the achievement gap between black and white students. And these 2 hypotheses really came from previous research I had done, not to the extent I've done for my thesis, but from other reports and stuff I've done leading up to my thesis. And I also thought that charter schools were not drastically affecting performance of Latino and white students. I remember sitting down with Sujin and Ted before I began my thesis and telling them to do this, and I was pretty confident, listen, I kind of know this is happening. They were like, well, I don't know. I was like, so I went into it thinking something different, that I was going to find something different. So I went about trying to quantify this effect through logistic regression. In the regression, we're just trying to quantify the exact effect that charter schools were having on African American and Latino students. My dependent variable, I had 5 years of API data from the California Department of Education. So the API was how I was going to measure the exact effect that charter schools were having on African American and Latino students. I test variable, the charter versus the non-charter. I had four independent variables: income, race, parent education level, and whether or not the teacher has a teacher credential. And my unit of analysis was elementary school. So my study encompassed all of the public elementary schools in the state. So it was about a sample size of about 6,000. My results of the study was not what I expected. I discovered that African American elementary school students, as compared to their peers in traditional, that African American students who enrolled in charters performed no better than African American students who enrolled in traditional schools. So the performance was about the same. Charters were not having a drastic effect. I discovered that Hispanic elementary school students who enrolled in charters, their API score dropped 11, 18 points as compared to Hispanic elementary students enrolled in traditional public school. So Hispanic students I found were seeing a drop of 11, 18 points. I had to measure the effect of white elementary students to see whether or not they were closing the achievement gap. I found that white elementary school students were doing progressively worse. Their API score was dropping 26 to 42 points as compared to white elementary students in traditional public schools. So this was definitely not what I expected going in, but it was on track with some other research I read about the effect of charter schools, especially the Credo study, which showed that on average, charter schools were not drastically affecting the performance of students.
Could you flip back to the methodology slide real quick? Dependent variables are API scores, test variables, charter schools, there's non-charters, control variables, so you're using percent African American and percent Latino?
Yes.
As your predictors?
Yes.
Okay, could you go to the next slide, please? Oh, no. I'm sorry, the result.
So I also found that charter schools were actually helping to close the achievement gap, but it was primarily because of the poor performance of white students in charter schools. So for example, if we look at for 2012, right, we see an overall crash score for Latino students is 771, white students is 879. But a Latino population enrolled in charter schools, their API score dropped 11 points, but for white students, their API score dropped 26 points. For Latinos, so the achievement gap between Latino and white students actually decreased by 15 points or 14%. So they were actually helping to close the achievement gap, but it was in a negative manner. It wasn't because of performances amongst Latino students.
And what year? So you put all of the years in the analysis, or you had a control variable for year? Or you were looking at differences between years?
The differences between years, I had control variables within for each regression.
Right, but so you have data from 2012, 2011, 10, and 9. So you put that all in one data set and ran it?
Correct. So I ran two regressions for each population for each year.
2 regressions for each population for each year.
So each year was done separately.
Correct, but yes, each year was done separately.
Ran them separately. Okay.
So Jim was my guiding light on my regression.
So Julie, now that he ran a lot of regression analyses. So he's summarizing the entire pattern.
So 2008 was done, 2009 was done, 2010 was done, 2011 was done, 2012 was seen in each one of those years.
But how do you control for family-wise error rate then? I mean, when you're running that many equations, something's bound to
What was the question?
luck, just by pure luck.
Well, what they're saying is they read them separately.
I understand about running them separately, but I mean, we can have a separate discussion, but it doesn't control your error rate. Goes up and up and up, family-wise error rate.
The family, tell me a little more.
Anyway, it doesn't matter
The
because.
more regressions you run, the more
results-
likely you are to get something significant, is what, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, the alternative is you trunk them all together and then we do a control for a year, but then you have, I mean, either way, you sort of have different issues, but I feel like this was sort of the cleanest, most intuitive. And then, you know, if you see sort of a lot of significance and just keep it in mind that we've run a bunch.
Yeah.
But we actually don't have that issue so much, so.
Well, I mean, you know what, it's kind of an aside to me, it's an interesting sort of methodological question, but your results just ring really true, so.
Yes, because I wasn't too far off.
So a panel was never ran?
You know, I mean,
No, because it's not longitudinal data per se, like it's not the same students necessarily.
No, it's the same school site though. These are school site data, these are not student data.
Right, so the
Correct.
school
So
site would,
You can put control variables in for school sites, and you're not controlling for everything that's going on at the school site, and have a much more powerful regression if you control for school A, school B, school C, because there's different curricular things going on there, there's different, besides just the 5 controls.
You're talking about like this side?
This is,
Yeah,
your-
fixed effects
what we're
that
talking
come out
about
for
here
both
is
years
your
and for the school sites. And that's the real power of having, all that data that you can really control for.
So so we've tried this, right? And this is, so first of all, this is really interesting. What we're doing right now is we're trying to think about like what the strengths are, right? And where to go next. The challenge is when you do a snapshot analysis like this, what you're getting is you're just testing the differences in the populations, right? Not necessarily the differences in the schools, right? And so what I've been trying to think about is how do you either A, think about this looking at it over time, or B, how do you do this at a student level for all students over time? Because otherwise, because we have analyses similar to these, what you're really testing is who enrolls in the charters and who enrolls in the traditional public schools, right? And so what this tells me is that, and what we really want to know is like over time, do you see those gaps change, right? So it just.
but you're still, I mean, unless we can assign students to schools, we're still just, like, no matter what methods we put on top of this, we're still just looking at students that go to charters versus students that don't, unless we can assign students to schools.
Right. And that was actually the gold level analysis methodology. What I was then, I'm using that student level data, but I wasn't able to get the CalPAS data where I could ever track the same student over time. I had to be school level data because CDE wouldn't grant me permission to use the CalPAS data. So this was my secondary option, which was the school side data. Now, if I had the student level data, I could see differences, right? I could see the growth patterns when they enroll. They were not proficient, test at this, and then within 3 years they were this. And this is the data set that I had to work with.
Good answer.
So for a recommendation for my thesis, I really recommended 3 things. And I recommended them to policymakers, like my boss, who's a policymaker. I said that districts, United States should decrease the number of charter schools they're authorized on an annual basis, purely because of it is not conclusive in a sense of the students' performances once they enroll in charter schools. And when charter schools do arrive from the district, they're often created from fiscal pressure among traditional schools. But I did also recommend that certain charter management organizations like a KIP, I could say, be allowed to expand because they're having their students are performing at levels that their peers in traditional schools are not. And my third recommendation was that if policymakers do decide to allow a charter operator, right, who hasn't been proven in a sense to improve performance, that they put certain practices in place that are almost guaranteed to increase student performance, which is longer school days and longer school years. That's what I have. Thank you. Any questions?
So one of the things, I've been called a charter lover and a charter hater in the same week, I think. And one of the things I think is what could be interesting in your data too, as a future sort of conversation, which is which are those charters that are high performing? Because we know that in the Credo survey, there are some charters that are high performing. But that comes with a caveat, because some of the high performance comes with limitations on access for certain students to those particular charters. There are charters like Great Hearts and Thesis. These are Arizona-based charters that have high levels of attrition on purpose because they see it as survival of the fittest, right? Is that the model we want? So yeah, there are high-performing charters that are not, but the high-performing charters that are actually serving kids who are at risk, who are special ed, who are ELL, and doing a good job of it, right? We know that those schools are in the minority in charter schools. We know that there's also a minority of those schools, the beating the odd schools in traditional public schools. So I think that second piece, because what the pushback on the first point would be that, well, there is some good examples of charters, right? And so what I told the legislature on this when they did SB2 in Texas was trim the fat before you lift the cap. Because we can look at the data and see these schools that are underperforming with these populations. I mean, that's really clear. We're talking about all these database analyses, and yet when it comes to charter schools, we just basically let them do whatever they want to do.
You can see the chart again with the different years of the race category.
Oh, the Achievement Gap chart?
Yes. So I thought it was interesting, and I'm not sure if I'm seeing this right, but in the API change column, I was just kind of looking within the races over the years, and it almost, for some of them, looks like, for example, for the white category, that the change goes in the positive direction over time. So it's less of a negative effect of charter schools on the whites over time.
Yeah, that's true, because in 2008, I mean, they were dropping, like compared to their license and traditional schools, 42 points, and 5 years later, they're dropping 26 points.
Right, and
So-
even with the blacks, that's interesting that, in 2009, we have kind of a positive change, and I'm kind of wondering, it would be interesting to see, what happened during that year that actually helped them score better in terms of their API score.
And that was the same thing I was doing. Every other year I had, my data was statistically insignificant.
Yeah.
A lot outside the range. But that was the 1 year also. I was like, okay, wow, they had a 22-point increase.
Right.
What happened in that year? But that was outside of the realm of my study. I just wanted to try to figure out the effect that charter schools were having.
And if you run it as a panel, you would be able to control for differences if there was any sort of statistical difference in any particular year.
Okay.
What I mean by panel is you list the data vertically, and then you have each data 1, 2, 3, 4 for each school.
Okay.
Because a lot of these analyses, if you notice, people eyeball them, right? There was this charter study that came out of Texas the other day, last couple of weeks, and there was like 3-point differences, and they're like, well, I look at this 3-point difference and it's larger than the other one, so it's definitely different, right? But what we didn't, they didn't give us any contextual ANOVAs or anything else to understand if that difference was actually statistically different from 0, right? So I think, sometimes we can eyeball these numbers and we can say, that looks bigger or smaller, right? But when we actually test the numbers, that's when we know whether they're interesting and unique enough for us for them to be statistically significant.
One thing about charters to think about is the selection bias issue. When people are in the public school, they're disgruntled in some way, and they're quite disgruntled because it's a huge effort.
Sure.
To begin a charter or to find a charter, to get your kid farther away from it. So is it all that bad that we find when somebody goes to a charter, they do the same as in the public school, or they even do slightly worse? Because you really don't know how much worse they were doing in the public school, because there is this selection bias that's coming out of it. So unless you have some really strong experimental evidence where you follow people, just because they're doing the same or doing worse in a charter school, this is compared to the population that remained in the public school, right? These are disgruntled kids who weren't doing, parents that for some reason weren't doing as well. So I think that has to be taken in mind when you do a direct comparison in this type of analysis between they're doing the same, and you said 80% are doing worse.
Or no, not better. So that 80% includes those who do worse and the same.
But 20% are doing better.
20%.
That's what I would say. That's great. that's good, 20% are actually doing better. That's a positive thing to point out.
And what I,
But it still has the selection effects and everything else.
But the public schools, I mean, have selection effects. People move out to public schools.
Yeah, I know, that's
you know,
such a common notion of voting with your feet, but a lot of people can't vote with their feet, so they.
I know,
stay in public
so
schools.
they set a charter, so they create a charter. You know, they can't move out of an inner city neighborhood because they can't afford to go to the suburbs to a better school.
But we're
So they vote with their feet by setting up a charter.
But you're assuming that that 20% is like randomly distributed in any district, and it's not like in some particular districts or in some place like the Harlem Children's Zone where they have tons of extra money.
But the other thing is, Bob, you can also tell the opposite story, which is the people who go to the charters are, for a whole bunch of reasons, are much more motivated anyway. They would have, you know, and they've got parents that are much more motivated. So, I mean, I think in some ways what I would see value of Michael's work is he can't get to he acknowledged that pretty candidly. What he can do is he can make some broad comment about whether charters in general are doing better for groups. And I think he's been appropriately clear about that. And the other thing I'd say, I wouldn't be, because I think Michael accurately portrayed where he was at the beginning of this research, which was not, and I think it'd be fair to say that both he was the winner, and Sujan, and probably particularly me, were saying, I don't know, Michael. And what I give him the credit for is doing what we always want students to do, and we say we want to do, which is just let the data take you where it goes. You know.
Yeah.
I tell students, don't worry if the story is different than you thought. That's not a problem. What's a problem is if you can't say anything interesting.
Yeah.
You learn from being, and the mistake, and I want to give him a lot of credit for this, he took the data where it led him.
I think the big rub from this study is that charter schools underperform traditional public schools. We can't talk about growth, we can't talk about things over time, but looking at the API, it's really clear that these schools don't perform so high.
and that's the piece I was actually really interested with, the parent motivation piece, right? When you're voting, I mean, a parent that typically enrolls their kid in charters, it's typically a little more motivated the parent, right, to have their kids succeed. Because, so, you know, that was a variable I wasn't able to capture. I thought that would be very interesting to kind of have in a study to really be able to identify how motivated are parents to enroll their kids in charter schools compared to a parent in a traditional underperforming school.
Well, and I mean, another thing is the issue of how the mobility rate, right? Because in low-income areas, public schools, new kids enroll every single day of the year. They leave every single day of the year. Some kids enroll in the year late, leave, go to another school, and then come back to the same school in 1 year. But with the charters, mostly you enroll when you enroll. And I mean, I have right now a super bright student who's principal of a charter school, and he was like, "What do you mean kids can enroll any day?"
Well, some
And
charter
he's
schools,
not trying to, I mean, he's doing an outstanding job. They're not trying to game anything.
this is actually
But-
a really big question. This week specifically is this conversation about backfilling. I don't know if any of you have been paying attention to this in that week or whatever, because charters do have high mobility rates. We, for example, saw at Texas that for a black student, that the mobility rate for charters was triple that of traditional public schools. Now, there's some recent stuff that came out of Susan Donarski and some other folks and disputed that, but the Texas data shows that. Now, the issue is who do they backfill with, right? Because there's specific rules about lotteries to get in, but there are not as specific rules about and follow-up and regulation on how charters backfill the slots.
Yeah, but there's research that shows that a lot of charters have specific dates you can enroll.
Sure.
And they would have application materials like write an essay talking about why you want to go to this school.
Right, which is
and they
different
require
than
parent
show
volunteer
up
hours.
and you're in every single day.
Sure, no. We're not disagreeing. What I'm saying is that charters have the leeway to decide who they backfill their school with, or to decide whether they backfill at all. Schools like Basis and Great Heart, they don't backfill. That's why their senior classes have like 23 kids in them and started with a couple of hundred. It's because they choose not to backfill. Now, there's other schools that choose to backfill, and the thing is that charters do that on their terms, whereas traditional public schools enroll on the terms of the public.
Yeah, I think no one here is in disagreement that charters have ways to select their students that traditional public schools can't. And that clearly impacts this.
I think Davis Public Schools has a way to select their students. It's called property values.
Yeah.
You can't afford to live there, right? And although there is open enrollment, they say, no, you're not welcome, we don't have space for you. So I mean, there are public schools do have very socioeconomic ways of selecting their students, and there is a selection bias that goes to them.
And then there's places like Berkeley who use census tracts to desegregate their schools because they can't do it because their parents involved, right? So I mean, I think communities can do this if they have the will to do it. I think it's the same with charter schools. Charter schools can enroll a diverse student body and keep that student body if they so choose. Unfortunately, as you look across the data, it varies school to school, charter school wise, whether they actually have policies that promote equity and access.
Like, you should point out, you did use the African American API score and the Latino API score, which is separated within the school site, in this analysis. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. When you're presenting it, I think at the research conference, that's an important thing to point out. People might not know if they're not familiar with the data set, because it is required. Before they used to just all be lumped together, and the strategy was just to raise your overall API score, but now you had to raise the subcategories within it. So that was an additional.
Yeah, and I think the big rub of this study is that charter schools are not performing as well as Waiting for Superman leads us to believe. I've debated Michelle Rhee on Twitter about this very issue, that they do not perform as well as we're led to believe. The data is the data. Now, you can argue about selection effects and student populations and these sorts of things. The bottom line is, if you look at the API, they underperform traditional public schools. So you could say it's because students are emptying out, or but that's the data. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to also reiterate what Ted said. I think you did a really great job on the presentation, and I particularly commend you on that ability to say, this is what I thought, but this is what I found. I mean, I'm trying to teach doctoral students to do that right now when they're going, but I didn't found that that's not what it's saying. And yeah, it's not what it's saying, so what is it saying? So that's really refreshing, and especially in this debate, I think refreshing.
The other thing is that Michael isn't saying at the end that charter schools are necessarily bad. He's saying that he actually still thinks that if charter schools do certain things, they can do well. But in some ways, I think what he's saying is we've got to get past these really gross, charter schools better. That's if we're going to talk about what makes charter, it's not simply be the charter. It's got to be other things, and maybe the other things are actually the critical things that they do. Not being the charter. Not being the charter per se.
And probably the most interesting study I found in my research was a study by Richard Foyer, economist out of Harvard, where he did a study where he injected the best practice of charter schools in a school district in Texas. And he found that once he injected these best practices with the traditional public schools, test scores rose, and the graduation rates rose. But the best practices philosophy, I think, is despite what school it is, if you inject these things that schools do well, and for the most part, kids will do better.
Right. Well, you mentioned that the longer school day, longer school year, which research seems to pretty consistently indicate matters, especially if you use the time well. But it's expensive, to have to pay everybody to work a longer day and a longer school year. But if we're willing to put our resources in, that would definitely,
I think you said, for like a quick example, the school where I operate the program out of for young men of college, high school, and for the past 3 years, they were trying to change their schedule to a block schedule, which would then increase the time that the teacher was there for about 30 minutes. And it was a 4-year battle when they just did it, which just to get, because it would allow the kids to take more classes at a longer period of time to help improve outcomes. But the school just was able to have the union vote in favor. So now, after 4 years, it was like 30 minutes extra. It's actually my wife right there.
I would also think, though, you know, most charter schools are relatively new, right? And a lot of them, especially the ones that are, like the Harlem Children's Zone or charter schools that are doing really well, what they are is they're new schools with new people that really have a strong commitment to, you know, the children they're serving. And if you could have a public school where you said, hey, let's open this brand new public school, we're only gonna pick the people with the same philosophy, and we're really dedicated to serving these children, I bet you would get, you know, terrific results as well. So,
And they have all those sort of like services and support, you know, they have after-school programs, they have things for parenting, they have childcare, they have, you know, healthcare support, and so it's not just the school in that instance, I should say.
it's wraparound.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what a great thing it would be if we could have that for all kids.
Any other
We all
thoughts?
have to move to Davis.
I know you began your exploration of this, you know, in 2007, and the idea of having interaction variables. You know, you have like a dummy variable that says this is a charter school, this is not a charter school, and that one variable is driving all of your results, but then that comes up an average, you know, for these 4,000 different elementary sites at any time. But, you know, is there a difference, say, for an urban charter school as opposed to a suburban? You know, so you interact with charter dummy with whether it's in an urban area or not. Or is there a difference when there's a higher percentage African Americans in the school than that? And did you try any of that? Did you have any results?
No, I did do interaction variable with this study, but with my 207 regression paper, I found that as the percentage of African American students rise within the school, the charter schools actually grows also.
The charter school did better.
Yeah, the charter school did better. So as the school became more homogeneous.
Yeah, so those are some very important factors. You basically now come to one conclusion across 4,000 elementary sites across the entire state of California. You know, so let's break it down and see if you can fine tune it a little bit. And yeah, I know there was some of that, you know, more poverty, more African American students, urban versus suburban, you know, where your charter schools have the effect. And interestingly would be the effect, yeah, in greater African American communities, greater poor communities, greater urban communities, you know, where they can have, because being the economist, that's where the voting with feet doesn't occur. You know, there's competition out in suburbia now. If you're not doing well, your people are going to pick up and leave, go someplace else, but not in these urban districts.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. And if you have any feedback for me, let me go back to my email on my presentation time for study, or there we go. If you have questions, please let me know.
Thank you.
Okay.